was, I guess you'd call it a colloquialism now, but there was something that people referred to, I hope affectionately, as the Talley Triangle. I called it the economic development process. And it was out of this concept that when people would come to us and say, all we need is one little old industry, I said, I know that's what they need, but you just don't get it that way. It's like that bushel of apples. You don't just one day say, let's hurry up and pick a bushel of apples. You've got to prepare for it. You've got to get that orchard working and keep it pruned and fertilized and watered. And ultimately, if you're lucky, if the weather's right and everything else, you'll get a bushel of apples. But you got to do these other things. And back in those days, I guess it was, I can't even remember whether it was in the 80s. I guess it was in the middle 80s. There was sort of a fad that we would go to a place called the Mansion, and people would, for I guess it was about a year or so, would indulge in adult beverages after work. And I remember going there occasionally, and I was sitting talking to one of our fellows in the organization. I said, look, you know, and I had this napkin in front of me, and I started drawing on it. And I said, you know, what we're involved in, and we may as well call it economic development, it's a process. It is a dynamic continuum of a process that somewhere up the line you begin to get some rewards. But you don't do that. It's like working out. You don't get faster until you practice. You don't increase your length for a marathon except over time and doing the right things, training and eating right and sleeping right, doing all these things. You can't, it's like in school when you at the last minute you cram for that final exam. You can't do that with this sort of thing. You can't do that in farming. You can't go and cram and then pick a bushel of corn. You got to start at the beginning and work it through in a dynamic continuum of process. And I said, I only know one thing, and I know this for certain, and that is that this process begins with leadership at the local level. And nothing happens without that. And I said, after that, there are all sorts of things that come into place. Leadership looks at the community. They have a survey. They consider their strengths and their weaknesses. They try to see who all's involved, and all these things added up to a number of items. And I went back and I said, look, I brought in the guys from the Community Development Department and said, look, this is my concept. And I want to develop something that we can show to people and get them to understand if they want the reward, they got to build it on a foundation. And I said, I want to make it in the form of a pyramid, and the bottom level is leadership. And ultimately we came up with leadership developing a strategy. And that strategy had to be based on reality, what that community was capable of. For example, you couldn't take Folkestone, Georgia, and say, let's make it an outlet mall, because it's just not on an interstate route. And you couldn't take Valdosta, which would have an outlet mall, and make it a regional international airport. So you looked at your community from a realistic standpoint, and out of that you developed a strategy. And that strategy caused you to put into place certain things to bring that strategy into fruition. If it was to bring in industry, we had to have an industrial park. What was our school system like? Was it adequate? What about all of our infrastructure and that sort of thing? Did we have an airport? Look at the infrastructure, the services, the mechanisms necessary to carry that strategy out. And then once you did that, then you sell that idea and that concept throughout that community so that everybody becomes a part of it. And you go back to that leadership, you leave no one out. No single person do you leave out of that leadership, because you get down the road, you left somebody out, and they can torpedo that thing just as quick as you could say New York minute, you know. And you sell that thing internally, and ultimately, if you work at it long enough and hard enough, you'll reach a conclusion which will be, hopefully, a successful one. If you don't do it, you will have some consequences.